The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and official-looking, with the Evergreen Hills HOA logo embossed in gold foil across the envelope. I set my coffee down on the kitchen counter and tore it open, expecting maybe a reminder about the annual meeting or some trivial update about pool hours. What I found instead made my blood run cold. Notice of violations and accumulated fines. The header screamed in bold red letters. My eyes scanned down the itemized list, each line more absurd than the last. Unauthorized fence extension, unapproved garden structures, non-compliant landscaping, illegal shed placement. The dollar amount stacked up like a horror movie budget, and at the bottom, circled 3 times in angry red ink, was the total, $247,500. I read it again, then a third time. This had to be a mistake. I'd lived in my house for 8 years, a beautiful craftsman-style home I'd inherited from my grandfather, situated on 5 acres at the edge of what had become Evergreen Hills. When I first moved in, the neighborhood was just being developed, and my property, with its old oak trees and sprawling gardens, had always felt like a peaceful refuge at the boundary of suburban life. The phone rang within minutes of me finishing the letter. I answered to find Margaret Chun, the HOA president, on the other end. Her voice had that particular quality of someone who enjoyed wielding small amounts of power. "Mr. Torres, I trust you received our notice," she said crisply. "I did, and there must be some mistake. These violations are very real and documented with photographic evidence. Your property has been in violation of our covenants and bylaws for quite some time. We've been patient, but the board voted unanimously last night. You have 30 days to pay the fines and remove all non-compliant structures, or we'll be forced to place a lien on your property." I felt my jaw tighten. "Margaret, my property isn't even part of the HOA. My grandfather built this house in 1978, decades before Evergreen Hills existed." There was a pause, then a condescending laugh. "Mr. Torres, I'm looking at the plat map right now. Your property is clearly within our boundaries. Perhaps you should review your deed more carefully." "I've reviewed my deed plenty of times. This is harassment. It's enforcement. 30 days, Mr. Torres. The board doesn't make exceptions." She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, hands shaking with anger, staring at the letter. $250,000 for having a fence that apparently extended 3 feet beyond some arbitrary line they'd drawn, for having my grandfather's old tool shed, for growing vegetables in raised garden beds. That night, I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios in my mind, lawyers, court battles, losing my home. In the morning, I did what I should have done immediately. I went to my grandfather's old filing cabinet in the basement, the one I'd been meaning to organize for years. The cabinet was stuffed with decades of paperwork, yellow documents, and faded photographs. I pulled out the thick folder labeled Property Deed and spread the contents across my grandfather's old workbench. The original deed was there, dated 1977, written in that formal legal language that makes your eyes cross. But as I read through it carefully, tracing the property boundaries with my finger, something caught my attention, a phrase I'd seen before but never really processed. "Including all mineral rights, easements, and appurtenant parcels as described in attached survey dated March 1977. I shuffled through the papers until I found the old survey, its blue lines faded but still legible. My breath caught in my throat. The survey showed my grandfather's property is 5 acres, yes, but there was another section, separated by a dotted line with a note. Reserved parcel, 847 acres, retained by grantor for future development or sale. 847 acres. I blinked at the number. That couldn't be right. I kept digging, pulling out more documents, letters from developers in the 1980s and 90s, offering to buy portions of the land. My grandfather's polite refusals, written in his careful handwriting. He'd been a stubborn man who loved his privacy and his land. Then I found the crucial document, dated 1995. A developer named Hastings and Associates had approached my grandfather about building a planned community on the surrounding acreage. According to the correspondence, they negotiated a 99-year lease for the land. Not a sale, a lease with very specific terms. My hands trembled as I read the lease agreement. The developer could build homes and infrastructure, but my grandfather retained ownership of the underlying land. The lease specified annual payments, restrictions on development near the original 5-acre homestead, and a clause that made my heart pound. Lessee acknowledges that lessor retains all rights to property usage determinations, and no homeowners association or governing body may supersede lessor's property rights within the lease territory. I grabbed my laptop and started searching property records online. It took hours of cross-referencing, but slowly the picture became clear. Hastings and Associates had developed Evergreen Hills in the late 1990s, building 247 homes on what they claimed was their land. But according to my grandfather's documents, they'd only leased it. When my grandfather passed away 8 years ago, I'd inherited everything, including, apparently, the land rights to the entire Evergreen Hills neighborhood. And nobody had bothered to keep paying the lease. I found the payment records in another folder. The developer had made regular payments until 2003, when Hastings and Associates dissolved after the founder's death. The payments simply stopped. My grandfather, in his declining health, probably never noticed. Neither had I, buried in grief in the chaos of settling his estate, which meant, according to lease terms, the agreement had been in default for over 20 years. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. The HOA had just threatened to put a lien on my property for $250,000, but I owned the land their entire neighborhood sat on. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney. Deborah Kim came highly recommended, and when I explained the situation in her downtown office, her eyes widened. "Let me get this straight," she said, spreading my grandfather's documents across her mahogany desk. "You have the original deed, the survey, and the lease agreement showing you own the underlying land rights." That's right. She studied the papers, making notes on her legal pad. "And the HOA is trying to fine you for violations on your own property? $250,000 worth." Deborah let out a low whistle. "Mr. Torres, this is quite a situation. If these documents are authentic, and we'll need to verify everything through county records, you don't just have a defense against their fines. You have leverage." "What kind of leverage?" She looked up at me with a slight smile. "The kind where you own the ground beneath 247 homes, and none of those homeowners have valid title to the land they think they own." My stomach dropped. I don't want to displace families. These are people's homes. I understand. But right now they're threatening yours. Let me research this and get back to you. 2 weeks later, Deborah called me back to her office. She'd done her homework. Every document had been verified, cross-referenced, and authenticated. The county records confirmed everything. I owned the land. The lease had defaulted. And technically, legally, the entire Evergreen Hills development was built on property I controlled. "What do I do?" I asked. "That depends on what you want," Deborah said. "We could pursue this aggressively, but that would create chaos for everyone. Or," she paused, tapping her pen against her notepad, "we could use this information strategically, make them understand their position." I thought about my neighbors, people I'd waved at the grocery store, whose kids I'd watched grow up. I just want them to leave me alone. I want to live in peace on my 5 acres. Then let's arrange a meeting with the HOA board. The meeting was scheduled for following Thursday evening in the Evergreen Hills Community Center. I arrived with Deborah, carrying a briefcase full of documents. Margaret Chun sat at the head of the table, flanked by 4 other board members, all wearing expressions of smug authority. "Mr. Torres," Margaret began, "I hope you're here to discuss your payment plan for the fines." Deborah set her briefcase on the table with a deliberate thunk. "Actually, we're here to discuss your organization's legal standing." Margaret's smile faltered. "I'm sorry. Mrs. Chun, are you aware of the property ownership structure underlying this neighborhood?" "Of course. Each homeowner has a deed to their property, and the HOA governs the common areas and enforces." "Let me stop you there." Deborah pulled out the first document. This is the original land survey from 1977, showing that Mr. Torres' grandfather owned 852 acres at this location. This She placed another paper down. It's the lease agreement from 1995, where Hastings and Associates leased 847 of those acres for development. And this, she added a third document with emphasis, is the payment record showing that Lease has been in default since 2003. The room went silent. Margaret picked up the papers, her face paling as she read. What does this mean? It means, Deborah said calmly, that Mr. Torres owns the land beneath every house in this neighborhood. Your HOA exists on property he controls. And you just threatened to fine him $250,000 for violations on his own land. One of the other board members, a man named Richard, spoke up. That's impossible. We all have deeds. You have deeds for the structures and improvements, Deborah explained. But the underlying land rights remained at the lessor, Mr. Torres's grandfather. When the lease defaulted, those rights reverted fully to his estate. Margaret looked like she might be sick. What do you want? I leaned forward. I want my fines dismissed. I want a written agreement that my 5 acres are completely exempt from all HOA rules, regulations, and oversight. And I want an easement guaranteeing my privacy. And if we refuse? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Deborah smiled politely. Then we'll be forced to explore Mr. Torres's full legal rights as landowner, which can include terminating the current arrangements and seeking fair market value for land usage over the past 22 years. Our preliminary calculations suggest that could exceed $40 million. The board members looked at each other in panic. Richard cleared his throat. Can we have a moment to discuss this privately? Take your time, I said. They huddled at the far end of the room, urgent whispers floating back to us. 5 minutes later, they returned. We accept your terms, Margaret said stiffly. We'll have our lawyer draft an agreement. Our lawyer will review it, Deborah countered. And once it's signed, we expect the fines to be formally rescinded and a public notice sent to all HOA members explaining that Mr. Torres's property is exempt from all association governance. Margaret nodded, defeated. Agreed. 3 weeks later, I stood in my garden, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. The raised beds were full of tomatoes and peppers. My grandfather's shed stood proudly in the corner, and my fence extended exactly as far as it needed to, all without fear of fines or harassment. The signed agreement sat framed on my wall, right next to my grandfather's old photograph. I liked to think he'd be proud. He'd always said the land would take care of me if I took care of it. He'd been right in ways I never imagined. From the edge of my property, I could see the lights of Evergreen Hills flickering on as families settled in for the evening. We'd all learned something valuable. They'd learned to respect boundaries and verify their facts before making threats. And I'd learned that sometimes the ground beneath your feet is worth more than anyone realizes. The HOA never bothered me again.